Hi, folks, and welcome to the Salty Seaman, where today we're going to talk about Transformers fiction. That's right. If you grew up with the 1880s show and you've seen the new Bay movies and you're kind of wondering, well, is there anything else out there? You're not maybe the biggest fan like myself. Think of this as a primer for you in the world of Transformers fiction. Hit it! Now, like I said in the intro, there's a lot of Transformer fiction out there. I mean, what most of us are familiar with is the 1980s cartoon. It's iconic. You either grew up on it or, you've seen the reruns on TV, the Hub, or watched it on Netflix or the DVDs. I mean, everyone and their grandmother, literally their grandmothers know this show. Started in 1984, Hasbro, imported all these Transformer robot toys from the company Takara and hired Marvel to come up with a great story for it, and they put it on their fledgling animation studio, Sunbow, same as they'd done for G.I. Joe for them. And it was gangbusters, man. I mean, that was the hottest property, 1984, 1985. TV, the toys, of course, are selling great. There was coloring books. There was a comic series. We'll talk about that in a second. Don't want to get too much into the cartoon. Like I said, you know it, you've seen it. You either, you have your nostalgia for it. Maybe not. I said, being a huge fan, I see the show's faults and minuses. It's pretty. I mean, for nostalgia filter wise, I can't ever hate on it. Sure, there are a lot of stinkers. Atlantis Attacks, City of Steel, Carnage in C minor. But there's great ones. The Golden Lagoon, The Face of the Nijaka, The Five Faces of Darkness. Season 3 really is great. It's Leaving Earth, more of a sci-fi show too, sci-fi feel to the show. I really like Season 3 a lot. Of course, grew up with the original first season, which is kind of introducing us to everybody. Season 2 had some cool stuff too. We get the second wave of toys came in, and you got Blaster and Trax and all these great toys and great characters. But there was another fiction ongoing in the 80s. We start off with that, the comic book. Like I said, Marvel did the license. They came up with the original concepts along with some help from Hasbro. I think someone at Hasbro themselves came up with the name Optimus Prime. I don't know who that guy is, but what a great name. A guy named Bob Budansky came up with the name Megatron. You might not know that. He was the primary writer for most of the U.S. run of the comic. He also the guy who wrote all the little tech specs, those little cards that are on the back with their personalities. He wrote all those. He was an editor for Marvel. Kind of got stuck with the job after John Romita, Marv Wolfman, and all these other people had started the original miniseries. Now, it does completely differ from the cartoon. If you grew up in the 80s, every cartoon about had some kind of toy or some kind of comic tie-in. Usually these are a lot of times adaptations of the cartoons. A lot of times they were just silly kind of throwaways. Marvel themselves did a lot of these, their Star imprint lines. This one wasn't on Star. It was actually its own comic imprint. Or it was his own comic, just under the Marvel name. Originally was set in Marvel Universe, the original miniseries. Spider-Man shows up. Nick Fury, I think Fantastic Four have a small cameo. So originally they were just going to do a 4-issue miniseries. They decided to continue on when it became successful. That's when Bob steps in. He was the original writer, and we get a lot of cool stories. Like I said, very different from what you saw in the cartoon. It wasn't being episodic comic format. It was a very continual story as opposed to like Villain of the Day doing the villainous thing of the day, which Megatron finds a new device and tries to take over the world. Wasn't quite like that. It was more of an ongoing story. In fact, Megatron's barely the leader in any of the U.S. run. He kind of got shafted. None of the two main writers, none of them seemed to like Megatron that much, I guess. He gets ousted as leader pretty early on by Shockwave, disappears for a while, comes back, is co-leader with Shockwave, then disappears again forever, and there's a series of leaders, and Ratbat is the leader at one point. Some of them aren't that great, okay, I'm not gonna lie, and if you didn't grow up with them, I actually can't recommend them that much, especially the early stuff. Some of the earlier issues are pretty good. There's a whole thing with Ratchet trying to get back the Autobots from Shockwave after he's decimated their forces, and he works with Megatron. It's a pretty good story. Then there's a return to Cybertron, which is our first glimpse of life on Cybertron, about issue 17, 18, I think. It's Blaster, Perceptor, It was like the second wave of the toys at the time, 85. Those are really good set. People really love those. And then it kind of gets bad. It was obvious Bob was a bit burnt out on writing this, but he continued till about issue 50 something, and they're not the greatest. If you have no nostalgia for that stuff, I can't really say diving into that as a new Transformer source. Maybe the later part when Simon Furman took over. Now, Simon Furman was the writer for the UK backup stories. The UK did the comics a little differently. They published weekly of the American comic, and then they would write backup stories in the back, and Furman kind of developed his own little mini world within a world with basically the leftover characters who weren't being used in the main comic. When Bob decided not to write anymore, he turned it over to Simon. He wrote the US, and he wrote all of them till it canceled originally at issue 80. And those later issues are pretty good. They brought the Matrix in, they brought the Unicron in. They weren't really used before. It was kind of a cartoon thing. Now, there was a Matrix, but it wasn't a physical thing, and then suddenly it was a physical thing, and no one really... It was kind of shoehorned in, but regardless, they're good stories. A lot of fan-favorite stuff comes from that, if you're any passing familiarity with the fandom of Transformers. The character Nightbeat gets a lot of love. You can tell Simon really loved his detective noir stuff. It's all over in there. A lot of world-spanning epicness, like the mythology of Transformers with Primus and Unicron and Dark Gods. All that comes from this run. So, if you're interested, I would suggest checking out the later issues. If you just really get into it and just want to be a completist, go ahead and check them all out. But it's not the strongest. Now, I mentioned there is, of course, the cartoon. Everyone knows it. It was on for 3 seasons plus the movie. It's kind of in the middle there. It was a theatrical release, and then there was a 3-part miniseries for season 4, and that was it. They introduced the Headmasters, and there was no more American TV. However, there was more Transformers fiction, cartoon-wise, out there. It was in Japan. I said before, Takara gave the original toys to Hasbro, and they came up with the concept with Marvel, and they reversed it back to Japan. Japan took their old toys and re-released them again under the Transformer brand, and they do the license here in Japan. And they continued the TV series after Americans ended. They kind of changed it up a bit. They ignored Headmasters and made their own storyline for all the Headmasters and Target Masters. Headmasters is again not the strongest, but the one saving factor is there was a really, really terrible dub done of it originally in English. It was broadcast on the American channel in Asia called Star TV. It's called the Malay dub in the fandom terms. I'm guessing it was made in Malaysia. It's really bad, but that's what makes it so good, because the story is kind of boring. There's a lot of filler. There's some cool stuff too. You really can see a lot of Six Shot if you're a fan of him. See a lot more Fort Max, Scorponok, some of those later characters that we don't know as well because they didn't get as much attention because they kind of came later in the line in the States. But in those stories, they do get a lot of attention, but they're pretty goofy, and it's Japan, so they had like 80-something episodes. A lot of them are just straight filler, but the dub is just hilarious. It's wildly inappropriate at times.
Fortress Maximus has come himself. Okay, then I shall get Fortress Maximus to fight me.
Weird name changes, like Blaster's called Billy, and Spike is called Sparkle, and no one knows why. There's a scene where Galvatron's yelling in anger that Soundwave got killed by Blaster, spoiler alert, and you know where he comes back. And he's supposed to be letting out this great yell of defeat and anguish over his trusted lieutenant dying, and they redubbed it as a yawn.
Darn that Soundwave.
I don't know why, but it's hilarious. That's about the best thing you can say about it. Followed up with a series called Master Force. Now, one thing to think about, Headmasters was basically Japan trying to do a version of an American cartoon. So it's kind of, it's part of the reason why it's wonky. Japan children's programming is kind of very in certain boxes, and the show really wasn't following one of those formulas, so it kind of came off weird. But the follow-up Master Force is very much a Japanese mecha show. It's right down to the Transformers are just robots. They are piloted by humans, and that's kind of it. It's not too bad. If you're an anime mecha guy, you probably like the show. It's the dub's a little better. Just the Melee dub is just so funny. I don't know why to watch it any other way. There's also a short one right after that called Zone. I really haven't seen that one. The animation looks really pretty from what I've seen, and some people rave about it. So again, it's very anime-esque. It's made in Japan, so you got that. Now so far, I'm not really probably whetting your appetite. Like, oh, is there any nothing I've really given a strong recommendation for? But this was the '80s. This was a kid's property, so it is what it is. Part of it helps if you grow up with it. If you don't, then it might be a little harder to get into. Some people don't. Some people love, stuff like that. But it did get better, and for me, where it really got good, and I still think is the all-time greatest Transformer fiction, except for maybe the last thing I'm going to talk about, was Beast Wars. Now, this is, if you're a 90s kid, one of them 90 kids, and you're still doing the whole 90s kid meme thing, good chance you did grow up with the show, and it might have been your first exposure to Transformers. You're new to it, you're an old fan, you missed the 90s completely and didn't know anything about it until the Bay movies. You might have missed this whole show, or just dismissed it out of hand. You're like, what, they turn into animals? It's a bunch of horse shit. Like, back in my day, they turned into cars like proper robots. But honestly, it is an awesome, awesome show. It's the best, altogether, I think the best show they've done, fiction-wise, period. Not just a TV show. The animation is probably the biggest hit you can give it to it right now, and maybe this first season's a little hit and miss in places. But for its time, I mean, it was the second time anyone ever tried to do CGI for a daily cartoon show after Reboot. It's made by the same company, Mainframe. But what really gets here is the characterization and writing. Bob Ford, Larry DiTillo were the story editors. They took it really seriously, not just a paycheck to write kids shows. They went and researched. They interacted with the older fandom and learned more about the history, because they were kind of starting with a blank slate. They knew nothing about Transformers, and they wanted to work in the mythos, and they did a really good job. And definitely by season 2, it became a really well, tight-paced show. And because character models are so expensive to animate in CGI, it was a much smaller cast, whereas the original show has a cast of thousands because they're trying to cram every toy they can. They couldn't do that, so they basically, every time someone was introduced, they had to kill off another guy just so they could keep the cost down. Or if they didn't kill them off, they disappeared for a while, stuff like that. But regardless, we get really good character studies of a lot of these characters. You really understand Rat Trap. You get a really great villain turned hero, turned back villain, turned hero, and a great sacrifice with Dinobot. You get, maybe one of the best versions of Megatron, though not the Megatron. He is, they're very clear he is someone who just had his namesake. With Beast Wars Megatron, a very Machiavellian villain who always seems to have when one plan doesn't work, he always seems to have a backup. And in the end, he wins. Spoiler alert. If you stop just at Beast Wars, it's a good happy ending, even though a lot of characters do die. But if you watch Beast Machines, you find out, nope, he won after all. And that's the follow-up. Little different style. They're back on Cybertron. They were kind of getting away from the Beast thing anyway in Beast Wars. They're kind of turned into weird mecha metal things, and now they're kind of mecha metal things that they're fighting vehicle robots. It's been the first time we'd seen vehicle robots in a long time at this point, so those were cool anyway. But the story was a little different. It's not bad by itself. It's a perfectly fine show. I do like a lot of aspects of it. But as a follow-up to Beast Wars, I think it's a disappointment. A lot of the ways they went, I didn't agree with. A lot of people really, really hate it. Unfortunately, there's also some vitriol against one of the head writers for that one, called a guy named Bob Skur. I don't get into it, but just there's some really stupid people in Transformer fandom. That's all you need to know. And that was Beast Machines, Beast Wars. Like I said, I can't recommend that one enough. There's a couple shows later on that were pretty close, but for my money, I still think this is the best one.